Welcome to the Wine Camp podcast, where we look deeply into regenerative, organic, and Demeter biodynamic certified wine growing and farming. My name is Craig Camp, and I am the general manager of Troon Vineyard and author of the Wine Camp blog at craigcamp.com, where I am chronicling our regenerative mission at Troon. This is meant to be a podcast for those that aspire to, as the Regenerative Organic Alliance says, farm like the world depends on it. These interviews will be focused on our work here at Troon Vineyard in Oregon's Applegate Valley, but will also include the work of other farmers committed to regenerative agriculture. And now for today's interview. Welcome to Troon Talk, where we dig deeply into Demeter biodynamic and regenerative organic gold certified farming and winemaking. Today's episode is part 2 of our discussion on the biodynamic preparations. The first episode delved into the field preparations, and on part 2, we are looking at the compost preparations, 502, 503, 504, 505, 506, and 507. Our guests today are Troon's longtime biodynamic agricultural consultant, Andrew Beedy, who has spent his entire life engaged with biodynamics as he was born on a biodynamic farm, and Troon Vineyard and Farm Director of Agriculture, Garett Long. Garett has a master's degree from UC Davis in soil science and has been practicing biodynamic farming for over a decade. Hi, Garett. It's great to return to one of our favorite topics, the compost preparations.
Well, I have been looking forward to this conversation as well for the past couple of months. It's been about 2 months or so since we've seen you last, and we're talking about the compost preparations today, biodynamic preparations 502 through 507. Andrew, when I first met you 10 years ago and was introduced to the concept of biodynamic preparations, it really challenged my notion of what biodynamics was all about. I think there is a spiritual component to the prep making process, as well as a very practical component. And I think a lot of our conversation today will kind of bounce between those different aspects that I think are inherent in the prep making. It was intended to be both practical, that is to address nutrient deficiencies or to enliven various elements of the farm or to bring biodiversity in. But there is very much a spiritual component too, and sort of a benefit to maybe the human spirit or a benefit to the practice of farming. And I think I hope that our conversation today will be able to balance all of those different reasons why people get into prep making. So maybe we can start with your reasons for prep making. Obviously, this is a part of the certification. To become a Demeter certified biodynamic farm, you're required to apply these preparations, but actually the making of them is really important, I think, in guiding our whole process. So what are your own reasons for getting into the prep work?
Well, I guess there would be one little point to make before we jump right into it, is when we talk about the compost preps, the herbal preparations that are added to our biodynamic compost, it's important to stress that we are talking about the organic forms of various minerals, so potassium, calcium, magnesium, iron, that we are trying to bring balance to into the compost. So it's an important difference between the organic form of minerals and the mineral form of minerals. The other part, important part to stress, is that when we talk about these preps, it's almost like a radiant energy that we are trying to harness within these herbs that we place in the pile. And each one of these herbs that make up the individual preps each have their own association between a planetary influence and an organic form of mineral influence, and they each bring their own radiancy within to that pile. And the processes or the quantities that we're talking about are homeopathic quantities. So just to put that out there and get that cleared up at the beginning to avoid any confusion when we talk about the minerals, It's not the mineral form of those minerals.
Yeah. And minerals is sort of another name for nutrients or elements,
Sure,
right?
sure. And to answer your question about the reasons why we get into prep making, well, beyond the fact that it is just a pillar of biodynamic farms, and it is one of the clear differences between organic farming and biodynamic farming, we've certainly found over the years that the act of making the preps, whether they are made perfectly or not, but the act of the farmer and the farming community to make these preps brings its own radiant energy into that farm. So, like we were saying earlier today, if we make preps that are not of the highest quality, either through a very wet, cold winter that we can perhaps put the reason of poor quality to poor inclement weather, don't let that discourage you from doing it again and refining that process.
Oh yeah, that 20 inches of rain we got this year is definitely my excuse for the poor quality horns that didn't totally develop. I'm going to blame it on the weather for sure.
Oh, you can always do that.
I think sometimes people think of the preparations as fertilizers, but don't you feel we are really talking about natural energies here?
Absolutely. So I guess if we go all the way back to the beginning, the series of lectures on biodynamic farming by Rudolf Steiner, the preps were discussed in lecture 6. So everything that we're talking about today in this discussion was only based on indications that were made over a 2-hour lecture, So it's there's been so much more development and research over the last almost 100-odd years about the processes involved within these preps that it's just like there's a whole wealth of knowledge there that brings its own. I'm going to keep saying radiant energy quite a lot in this, but it's really important to stress that these organic forms of these plant nutrients are bringing that organic processes into your compost. And that's just the beginning of it, right? That's just the beginning of that influence on your farm. When you apply that compost out onto your farm or your vineyard here at Troon, those processes continue. And if you want to continue that process further, the repeat application of biodynamic compost containing these 6 herb preparations is where you'll really find success.
And I think furthermore, I mean, just to add on to that, the indications that Steiner was giving were largely, as I understand it, in response to chemical fertilizers and synthetic nitrogen specifically being invented and then widely applied on farms across Europe, and that farmers were finding that their crops were imbalanced. Big, lush, abundant, leafy growth also attracts pests and disease. And so, as Craig was just asking that question, these preparations and the act of prep making is not a substitute for fertilizers. In fact, they were originally presented as a solution, an alternative to fertilizers, chemical synthetic fertilizers, as a way of bringing balance into the farm.
Or even just beyond the use of synthetics, let's just use a practical example in biodynamics and at Troon. If we want to increase calcium within our soils, that will then increase calcium levels in our vines, then we have 2 ways of doing that. We can add calcium sulfate or lime or whatever, or we can use these preparations to try and enliven the calcium that's within the soil and make that become more available. So in a practical world, you need to have both. You can't just have a mineral form of calcium, because how is that going to be able to be translated into your plant without becoming either more available through microbial life, or in a biodynamic sense bringing in another form of calcium in a homeopathic measurement, I guess, or quantity. But who's to say which one has more of an effect on calcium? Calcium being oak bark preparation.
And the fact that these are compost preparations, these herbal preparations inserted into compost piles during the active decomposition and then eventually the maturation or the maturing of the compost. The compost itself sort of acts as a delivery mechanism, or almost as like a way of stimulating these calcium processes in the soil. We keep going back to calcium, but choose your own element, choose your mineral here. Each of these compost preparations has particular associations with certain elements or nutrients, and the compost itself acts as a delivery mechanism. And with that compost comes not just that intentionally prepared herbal prep that's spent the better part of a year, in our case, composting, but coming with that is also this huge suite of diverse microorganisms. Our compost is built out of landscape debris and weeds and kitchen scraps. There's eggshells, there's organic dairy manure, there's some old moldy hay, there's the pumice from the winemaking process, and each of these materials is enlivened with a different set of microorganisms that is adapted to breaking that down. And through the composting process, that diversity sort of waxes and wanes with factors like heat and changes in pH and changes in temperature and all these things. But ultimately what we get is, ideally, as a finished product, when we're doing it well, we get this finished, year-old, well-rotted, well-decomposed compost that is balanced, that has hopefully been washed of too much salinity, that has been brought back into balance with a good carbon to nitrogen ratio, etc. So I see the compost as this delivery mechanism where these microorganisms are being added to the soil to help enliven it and stimulate the cycling of some of these nutrients.
Let's start there. Our first episode was the field preparations, 500, 501, 508, which are applied in the vineyard. All of these preparations we're talking about today are applied to compost. The compost is then the vehicle to take them onto the farm. What is the difference between compost, organic compost, and biodynamic compost?
In the most simplest form, the difference between organic compost and biodynamic compost is the inclusion of the compost preps into the piles. But I think it's important to stress that the biodynamic preps, in my mind, shouldn't just be restricted to the use on biodynamic farms. So the question is the difference between organic compost, biodynamic compost, and I guess conventional compost. The clearest difference is the use of preps, the herbal compost preps in a biodynamic pile are not included in a what you could call an organic pile. But I think it's important to stress that the biodynamic preps, in my mind, shouldn't just be restricted to the use on biodynamic farms. I think there's a great opportunity to use them outside of our certified biodynamic farms. I guess the certified organic compost, per the federal rules, they have a very strict guideline of the number of turns, which is, physically turning the pile over, 5 turns in 15 days with a really high temperature, minimum temperature that they want to see in consistently within those piles over those 2 weeks are 136, I think it is.
132 to 170 is the range.
All right. So that, just using the temperature as an example of the difference, in a biodynamic sense, we're going for a slow, lower temp composting process that is aerobic, but not, I guess another example would be an organic pile. They stress the thermophilic phase of decomposition, which is the heap phase, whereas our focus in a biodynamic sense is more on the mesophilic phase, which is the slow process of decomposition that comes after that initial heat spike when you build that pile. The preps work well in the second stage of compost, where they bring their balance and their energy to that, which is why after we build a pile, we generally have a delay in adding them to the pile and just let the pile get settled, go through its initial heat spike, and then we come in with the herbs.
I'm glad you said that. It was something that I struggled with, having a background in soil science and thinking that I know something about those phases that you're talking about in composting process. When you first build a compost pile and you first, get the whole thing up to proper moisture, you're waking up all these microbes. They get really, really active. And as they're decomposing the materials around them, metabolism, and we're all doing that every moment of our lives, we're breaking these carbon to carbon bonds and releasing heat. And that is where the heat that comes from that's generated from a compost pile is actually just microbial life decomposing and respiring, breathing out CO2, all this stuff around them. So initially they go through that heat spike, and then, as you said, as their activity levels drop or get slower, then the temperature also drops. And as it drops down into that mesophilic range, it becomes habitable by a greater range of microorganisms that are tolerant of those kind of mesophilic or those middle temperatures, as opposed to only those extremophiles, those microbes that love that hot temperature. Those are the only ones thriving, and those are the only ones that are super active during that thermophilic or that heating phase. And so, as you're saying, our goal is to drop down into that mesophilic range before adding the preparations. And my thought was always like, of course, that makes sense. Why would you heat up, or why would you prepare a compost pile and then take these carefully and intentionally prepared herbal preparations and put them into a steaming hot 140 degree pile where it's just going to essentially cook out the microbial life of your preps? And so the timing of adding this preps is important. And in an ideal process of making biodynamic compost, you have an opportunity to add preparations multiple times, right?
Absolutely. I mean, like we always say, doing it once is great, but if you can do it numerous times, the more rhythm you have on your farm. Yeah. So, building our piles with intention of layering on, carbon layers and nitrogen layers and, landscape debris from within the farm, the vineyard, then adding the right amount of water, using special compost covers, and timing our addition of the herb preparations, well, that's how you're going to end up with a true compost that is actually of a benefit to your farm. So building compost from the right ingredients is kind of like, baking a cake. If you choose flour from Walmart rather than organic dairy manure from down the road, then the compost, it's great. It's still a cake and it's still a compost, but there's an opportunity there to do it better.
So obviously compost is foundational to biodynamic farming. The making of the preps themselves is not that difficult once you learn the process. The compost program is complex and expensive, but as the foundational element of biodynamic farming, what does our composting program bring to our farm?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I would say most importantly, it's adding microorganisms. It's adding this diverse soil life. And one thing that I think about as the compost goes into that mesophilic range and starts to get populated by diverse microbes, it's also populated by worms. Earthworms start coming up in it when it's aged properly. And there's this diverse set of microorganisms in the guts of worms that help them break down mouthfuls of soil and get nutrition out of it. So the microbes that are left behind in worm castings or worm poop are loaded with these microbes that are specialists in that. And so I would say the delivery of the most diverse set of microorganisms that we could get out on the farm to help cycle nutrients, build organic matter, and help bring balance and resilience to, especially to the root zone of these crops, is a primary goal of compost. And then there's other reasons as well, right?
Well, of course. I mean, like, we'll go back to the same conversation we've had numerous times over the years, where the three realms of soil, the biological, the organic, and the mineral. Well, compost is the glue that will bring balance, or one of the major tools that we have to bring balance into those three realms. Whereas the preps that we've been talking about will serve to bring balance of the mineral realm in an organic form into the compost. Then when you apply that compost, you're bringing not just through the media of the compost the three realms of soil into balance, but you're also adding a chance to bring the organic forms of minerals to help balance out the one mineral realm of soil by adding that additional organic form of potassium, calcium, magnesium, iron.
And all the micronutrients as well, which if you think about a lot of, fertilizers that are, intended to add just maybe one or two different elements, compost actually has the whole suite of 17 essential plant nutrients and probably some other elements out there too that we don't even know about their role in the environment.
But isn't the role of compost not so much that it has these elements, these nutrients, but it gives the soil, the mycorrhizal community, the ability to make these nutrients available to the plants?
I mean, I think about the granite, largely of a granite source. The Siskiyou Mountains surrounding the Applegate Valley here in southern Oregon are made of granite. And if we look at the mineralogy of granite, it essentially has all or most of those minerals that our plants need to survive. But they're bound up. They're rocks. They're literally rocks. And rocks are not accessible to plants directly. Plants, as well as microbes, will excrete some kind of organic acids and enzymes and things to literally weather and break down these rocks into these tiny little forms so that they can be taken up by roots. But yeah, I think if I follow what you're saying, Craig, I think it all gets back to the soil life. It gets back to the microbiology that are specializing in breaking down those rocks, breaking down soil, and releasing those minerals back to the plant. But again, it's not as simple as just chemical nutrition. It's not just this plant needs X pounds of nitrogen per year. It's about so much more than that. And something that I learned in my graduate studies at Davis is the forms of these minerals that plants take up are actually way more diverse than we ever knew. We always thought that they were in this little simple ionic form, like essentially one or just a handful of atoms, like the smallest possible charged ionic form is the only thing that plants could take up. And what modern research has shown is there's actually these huge macromolecules, almost like big proteins that contain nitrogen, yes, but have dozens or hundreds of individual atoms in them, much larger than we ever thought a plant root could drink up. And I think it's some of these more diverse macromolecules that are mobilized or created by the relationship between plants and microbes and that mineral form that are being sort of unlocked by what compost brings to the soil.
Farming the soil, right, Andrew?
It has something to do with it. Yeah, we try and keep that in our forefront. But But I think and this is a wonderful conversation, but I think we've been talking about these preps in abstract. I think we need to go into, what these individual, and I'm going to put it in air quotes here because we don't have video, but each of these preps, 6 different herbs: yarrow, chamomile, oak bark, dandelion, stingy nettle, and valerian, all have individual relationships to both a mineral or a group of minerals, or it can be 1 or 2 minerals, but also has a relationship to what one could call the esoteric or the astral body, which is key. Another foundation of biodynamics is bringing in influences from beyond your farm, right? So everybody knows we bury horns on a descending moon. We plant cabbages on a descending moon. But there is much more opportunity out there than simply bringing in the most immediate effects from our nearest planetary body, which is, everybody knows it's our moon. These preps, they all have individual names, numerical names, which are Yarrow is 502, 503, 4, 5, 6, and 7 are the compost preps. 5 of those are humus-based materials that are processed in individual manners. The 7th is a liquid tincture that we make out of valerian that's applied not just in the pile after building, but is also applied as a fine mist around the pile. If we just take the dandelion preparation, 506, we can see that this preparation is bringing in the effects of calcium and silicic acid. It has an astral association with Jupiter. We can then see that harvesting the flowers in the morning before they are open, we have an opportunity to dry them slightly. We then place these dandelion flowers in a cow's mesentery, which is the organ that contains the digestive organs in one area. We then bury this in the fall. Then we lift, so it spends the fall, winter, and spring in the ground. Then we lift it up, and that will form our astral organic form of calcium and silicic acid that we then add back into the pile. That when the compost pile, that when that compost is applied, we are intending to continue that radiancy of that organic form, silicic acid and calcium. And I mentioned just the relationship with Jupiter. You look at a dandelion that's fully opened and gone to seed, well, it's a perfect sphere and looks, very much like a planet. We have these indications from Steiner in those initial lectures, followed by numerous years of further research and development, where we can really see that these plant nutrients have specific relationships to specific flowers that have specific relationships to specific planets that in turn reflect back into certain flowering plants. So I'm just going to use Jupiter as the example of reflecting white and red flowers. I have a very close association with those colored flowers, and coincidentally vines flowers are white. So we can see that I don't have to talk for ages about this, but you can see where people turn, if they have a calcium issue, well, let's just put some calcium sulfate out. It's a heck of a lot easier. But is it the way that you can really fix the problem that you're trying to fix? Or are you simply putting a Band-Aid on your problem but not addressing it? So with these preparations, we are using these individual herbs processed in individual ways that work to bring in that astral body onto your farm.
Yeah, I think maybe another way to think about that is, in the comparison of putting out a fertilizer versus using, intentionally prepared compost. To use your Band-Aid metaphor, fertilizer is a one-time addition that'll last for maybe at best a couple of years to feed your plant directly. Compost is really seen as feeding the soil, right? We are regenerating soil health by enlivening the soil, returning soil microbes back to it, by adding nutrition, by building organic matter. All of that is adding this organic form of nutrition that you're talking about back to the soil, so that, again, those relationships between plants and microbes can continue to grow, again, largely through the plants supporting the microbes. They're releasing carbon into the soil that the microbes are using as an energy source. They're using that to break down the soil around them and feed the nutrients back to the plant. That symbiotic relationship either doesn't exist or has been inhibited by the use of fertilizers. If plants have all the phosphorus and nitrogen they need, they're not going to be feeding those carbon resources to the soil microbes, who will then in turn release those nutrients back to the plant. They just don't invest that energy, and research has really demonstrated that again and again. So really what we're trying to do with these preparations and with compost is enliven the soil, not give it a one-time fix or sort of a temporary Band-Aid fix, but really regenerate soil health for generations.
Isn't this all about natural systems? You're trying to support the natural system, not interject yourself into it.
Correct. And it doesn't have to be an and or, we're talking about calcium here. We also used calcium sulfate when we developed new blocks out here. Yeah. But that is not going to solve our calcium problems. It will help bring more balance to it, the soil sphere, but for the long-term benefits, you have to turn to the organic forms.
Yeah, and I think to also just to justify
elements.
that fertilizer addition that we did of adding gypsum or that calcium sulfate out to the fields in the development of these new vineyard blocks, and also to our cider apple orchard or vegetable garden, we tried to build the calcium stores in the soil by adding this mined mineral version of calcium to it. But that was all driven by soil testing. That was driven by data. We found that, even though I was just talking about the fertility of the granite around us, of this decomposed granite soils, calcium is actually one that is closely associated with magnesium, in the sense that we think about the calcium to magnesium balance, and that they interact in the soil very similarly. They're a similar sized ion, they're similar charge, cation, and so they will compete in the soil if there's calcium and magnesium, of which there's always some balance. Our calcium to magnesium ratio is low, so we tried to boost that. We saw that it was low in soil tests. We tried to add that to the soil to initially bring balance to what our plants, in what is admittedly all forms of agriculture, are admittedly a sort of a contrived version of it. Biodynamics presents a framework in which we can try to work with nature, or sort of coexist by working with these natural processes, building building nature, but overlaid our agricultural goals of harvesting a crop, feeding our community, nourishing ourselves, providing jobs, all of these elements that are a part of agriculture.
Making good wine. Just putting that out there.
Absolutely. Yeah, all of these are goals of agriculture. But yeah, I mean, we're really trying to work with nature and create the most natural, quote unquote, system possible. And biodynamics is really a framework for that. But we try to do so in a practical way, in a data-driven way, where we have these resources at our disposal, like soil test labs, to be able to analyze the composition of all of these elements. And we know, again, from research and the hundreds of years of agricultural research, that we know that plants need elements in different amounts. They need more nitrogen than just about any other element out there. And so we knew going into it that our calcium was low here in our soil. So that was some initial justification for adding that building that reserve, that soil reserve of calcium, and then layering on top of that. Then we start getting into everything we've been talking about, the role of compost and microorganisms in maintaining that balance and keeping that calcium in the system.
Right, and just to add some more detail to these preps that we're talking about, Yarrow preparation 502 is the number for that. Ground Yarrow flowers are harvested in the morning, ground, then placed in a stag's bladder, hung up in the summer months, then placed in the ground for the fall, winter, and early spring, and then lifted up. That forms our organic form of sulfur and potassium, works to balance those out. But we get lots of questions about why these animal, I guess you could call them sheaths, that we use around these herbs. These indications were from Steiner in the 6th lecture, I think it was. An initial indication was using a stag's, and specifically a stag, who everyone knows they have large antlers that are very skittish. They are all up in their mind. They are more in the heavens than they are on the ground, on the earth. They are very, you could call an astral body. We connect that influence or that energy with the herb form or the organic form of potassium and sulfur. We then combine those two through the actual organ of, it's connected with the kidneys, it's cleaning, it's keeping the body safe, it's removing contaminants, I guess you could call them, keeping the blood healthy. We then combine those two realms, so the animal realm and the plant realm, with a connection to the astral body through the antlers. Then the process of hanging in the sun, capturing the solar sun energy, buried in the fall, capturing that in-breath in the fall, digesting, decomposing, and almost considering the in-breath of the winter months, then capturing that early spring transition from winter dormancy into first flush in our vineyards, lifted up. Then when you apply that material, which is a very dark, coffee ground texture material at very dilute homeopathic quantities, so 1 gram or 5 grams, something like that, per 10 tons of compost, the idea is to capture all those elements, combine them into a humus product or material, then get that out on your land first once through compost, then through repeat use of compost over the years, you then build that rhythm.
I think a question that I get a lot is where you started of why those animal sheaths, and also why those specific 6 herbs. Why those? And I've started to think of them as their sort of masters. They're like they're specialists in their relationships with these elements, right? And I think of, maybe most importantly, one of the just key terms that stuck out with me in my about decade practice of biodynamics is relationships. The relationship between form and function, the relationship between form and particular elements is apparent. We're talking about the Yarrow preparation right now, and if you can maybe close your eyes and imagine the Yarrow plant, Achillea millefolium, it means like 1,000 leaves. It has, a really, really kind of fern-like dense leaf structure, but really the blossoms are what are used in the preparation rather than the leaves. The blossoms are presented not unlike the antlers of the male deer. They reach for the heavens. The plant, the stems of the plant itself branches out and creates multiple little clusters of flowers within those flowers that are all aligned in a plane, sort of parallel, if you will, to the heavens and parallel to the earth below. This plane of Yarrow blossoms is presented, like I said, like the antlers of a deer. And so there appears to me to be this relationship or this similarity between the presentation of the Yarrow blossoms and the presentation of the antlers. What is, can you talk a little bit more about why the marriage of those two? What is that relationship between form and function, both in the Yarrow prep and in general in the selection of the animal sheath and the herb that it's paired with?
Sure. So just one little, maybe it's not a caveat, but in the lecture where Steiner gave these indications of the plant, he was very forthcoming and said, you can always substitute. Always use, there's another plant or another cultivar that will work well on your farm. Go ahead and try.
He really
try it out.
Experimentation.
So a lot of this is initial indication. But to answer your question, form has a plays a very important role in these plant selections. So if we just use what is called 504, the stinging nettle, that plant, well, as we all know, we all drink, nettle tea if you have an upset stomach, which brings a lot of rhythm and balance to imbalanced systems. But when you actually look at the stem of that plant, it's very angular, it's very structured, it's very square corners, very true corners. So combining these inherent, qualities, both in form, nettle being structured, very true corners, through that decomposition and that processing of that form, you may bring balance to your imbalanced system by adding that form. So that's a whole another conversation that you can talk for many hours about the individual forms of these plants, but the qualities and the energies that they bring are where you'll get your benefit.
So we kind of tackled 506, the dandelion preparation, and 502, the Yarrow preparation. Which one do you want to talk about next, Andrew?
Well, I think we should do it in numerical order.
Yeah, let's go back to the beginning.
502, we just did that. 503, chamomile, harvested early spring. The animal sheath is cow's intestines, associated with calcium, both in the color of the flower, but in the form. We fill the intestines with chamomile flowers, ground, then buried in the fall, lifted, very similar way as the 502, lifted in the springtime, and that's our organic form of calcium again. We then turn to 504, which was the nettle one we just touched on. That one actually doesn't have a animal sheath. We just bury, we harvest the whole plant before flowering, so in its vegetative growth ideally, or vegetative stage. That's ground up into a fine texture that's buried in the ground for a full year in a clay, terracotta pot, something like that. That is a balancing, or helps to balance iron, magnesium, that push-pull. You can also just add form, like we said, to an imbalanced system. So it's I think Steiner called it like a jack of all trade, right? It's kind of, you can drink it if you want, if you have an upset stomach. Then we go to 505, oak bark, 3% give or take calcium within the oak bark. That is harvested usually in the spring, but I'm not so particular about the time of year for harvesting. That's actually ground and placed into ideally a ruminant animal's skull. That goes through a year of sort of transitioning or composting or transforming in a very, interesting enough, that's the only one that goes through an anaerobic decomposition. Everything we've been talking about in most everything else of biodynamics is in the aerobic realm. That preparation associated with the planetary body of the moon brings in high lunar influences. Then we go to the dandelion, 506, which we've talked about. Then the final one is the valerian, that also doesn't have a animal or a sort of period of time within the ground, is the Valerian officinalis, that we harvest the flowers pre-petal fall. So when they're still, they haven't hardened off. That we make our tincture out of. So we harvest a whole bunch of them and we end up with 100 ml or something like that. It can be very, but again, it's like the quality, not quantity, right?
And we're sort of juicing. We're using a press to extract the juice
exactly
from those blossoms.
Exactly. So we harvest the flowers. Some people make it into like a little pesto type of structure, and then, as you said, go through a metal press that you tighten once every hour or every 30 minutes, and you get another couple mil, and then patience is a virtue, but you end up with a very floral, sweet smelling material that we then apply outside, or both inside and outside of the pile, of the compost pile. There are, like everything, there are many different opinions on timing and placement and when they should be put in and where they should be put in and
in what order
and yada yada yada. But we place about 5 grams or a teaspoon, say, in American, of each prep per 10 tons into the pile by about what would you say, maybe a foot deep or 2 feet deep?
I usually use the tips of my fingertips to my elbows. I'd say for me it's closer to 2 feet deep, but elbow deep in the compost pile.
And our piles, just so people can visualize the pile that we're talking about, are 14 feet wide, 60 feet long, 5.5 feet high. So we add around about 4 teaspoons of each preparation into the pile. We do 3 on, what do we do? 3 on one side, 3 on the other. People can get very creative on what number they put on each side and the order that they do it. But I'm a believer in the process of doing it is a good place to start. And if you want to refine from there, sounds great.
And then, we talked about this opportunity to add preps multiple times, the composting process. So you talked about sort of prepping the pile, as we say, prepping the compost pile is that initial insertion of these 6 preparations, both inside and then, sort of showering this fermented valerian blossom extract mist over the outside. The process of composting then continues. And as I understand, the role of the preparations is to sort of guide that process. Yes, we're trying to enliven and make available these mineral elements within the pile, but I think of them as sort of more of almost a spiritual or energetic guide to the composting process.
I mean, they're more like, they're kind of like stewards, right? They're just, they keep the composting in the right manner. So I think using them as a guide is a good illustration of their process that they bring to that pile, for sure. But I think it's important for us to just, in our management of viticulture at Troon, or the growing of apples, or your vegetable garden, or your cut flower gardens, or your landscape, is we use both the analytical side of lab testing and chemical analysis. We also use this organic, more biodynamic processes. But I think it's important to stress that if we just view these preparations from a purely analytical, scientific viewpoint, then we're being kind of crazy, right? We are putting chamomile in an intestine in an analytical view. That is a pretty silly thing to do. But once one considers the reasons for doing it that we've spoken about over the past few minutes, you can really begin to see that there is some method to our madness. And that method to our madness is really reflected in the balance of our vine, apple, vegetable, animal health. So is that all due to these 6 herbs? Likely not. But using these herbs as stewards to guide and enliven our compost, the repeat application of that compost is where you will find balance in your system.
Yeah. I would also, I feel this need to almost justify the practices sometimes, because the skeptics or the critics are sort of, suggesting that biodynamics or the preps specifically can be unscientific. And something that I like to remind people of and acknowledge is that even though it wasn't explicitly said by Steiner, and with the utmost respect to him and recognizing that he was, a white Austrian philosopher in Central Europe in the earliest 20th century, I think what he is invoking is thousands and thousands of years of human evolution and experimentation with herbal medicine from cultures all around the world that were likely colonized by Europeans. And that knowledge, that wisdom that is built into nature, that our ancestors, that indigenous people all over the world for tens of thousands of years have been using these specific plants, and specifically the yarrow, the nettle, the chamomile, these herbs that Steiner called out as sort of nature's healing herbs. These have been used as medicine, that have been used to catalyze physiological change or healing in the human body for centuries, for millennia. And I think as a justification for the selection of those herbs, as a justification for their role in sort of stewarding or shepherding the decomposition of a compost pile, again, at sort of first blush sounds unscientific and sounds a little crazy, frankly. But I think when you really consider not just the past 100 years of this agricultural experiment of using industrial synthetic chemicals and pesticides in agriculture, but you instead look at the tens of thousands of years of human history and our relationship with the healing properties of these herbal remedies, to bring them into our practice of agriculture is to do what our ancestors have done for thousands of years, which also includes looking to the stars and the moon and planetary rhythms to guide the timing of some of these practices. So again, what feels sort of at first glance as crazy in terms of the scope of modern agriculture and how technologies have advanced arguably beyond these things, we look back to, the reason why they were initially used as healing remedies, and try to apply them to our agriculture to heal our fields and heal ourselves, and ultimately I think our relationships with our communities and maybe our relationships with planetary health, right?
Absolutely. I mean, while you were speaking, I was just thinking that to tie it into homeopathic medicine, because we are talking about homeopathic quantities here in these preps. When one of my kids will fall off their bike and scratch their knee, well, we don't go into like putting a synthetic, ointment on there. We go and we put calendula on it, right? And the fact that actually heals that cut within a couple of days is proof, in my mind, as a parent, that homeopathic remedies do actually work. And that's just a practical, obvious observation. Now, to translate that into farming, well, we don't have to fully understand everything about how these preps work. I don't have to fully understand how calendula heals a cut on my kids. But the proof is in the pudding, so to speak.
There's a lot about agricultural science that is not well understood. Many things we don't know the answers to. I like to think of biodynamics as respecting what we don't know.
You have to approach farming with a certain amount of humility. Like, we are putting our analytical mind onto a plant that's growing in the environment. Well, there's only so much we can really know about that. We might think we know everything, but we kind of don't.
I actually think that there's for me personally, I think there's a benefit of sort of like a comfort maybe of living in that sort of gray zone, that unknown zone, and having a little bit of faith, knowing that the proof will be in the pudding, or the proof will be in that calendula bandage, or the proof will be in that glass of wine that's reflective of place. It's okay for me to not understand the quantum physics behind the energetics of what's really happening inside that compost pile by the uncountable trillions of microbes that are interacting with these preparations and all the diverse materials we put in there. I'm okay actually not understanding the total complexities of it, because I think our planet and soil health and all of this and human health is all very, very complex and inextricably linked between biology, chemistry, physics, geology. All of these we're trying to interpret to the best of our abilities. But I think when something's working, like calendula that heals a wound, or a Yarrow preparation that helps, unlock nitrogen in the soil. When the outcome is what we intend it to be, even if we can't perfectly connect A to B, or maybe our best, most modern sensitive scientific instruments cannot detect or explain how we got from A to B, we still know that we got to that final position and achieved that goal of balance or of healing, right?
Radiant energy within the preps themselves, as we've discussed, bring certain plant nutrients alive and become more receptive and more open to being taken up by plants. In my own sense of working with the individual preparations is they actually work not just on the compost, but they actually work through their energy, radiant energy, into the farmer themselves, right? They're actually not just being stewards of these nutrients, elements, or astral bodies. They're actually being students or stewards as well on ourselves, as Garett mentioned, as the farmer or the person making them. So it's a chance to appreciate that energy.
Well, as I started to say earlier, I think one of the real benefits of the preps is getting you out into your fields and really connecting, observing those rhythms. Biodynamics has come a long way in the last 100 years. 1924 was the year Steiner gave this initial week-long course, and we're on the precipice of the 100-year anniversary of that introduction to biodynamics. In that 100 years, there's been enormous experimentation, and I would argue lessons and sort of benefit to those practitioners who experiment. Those who get out into whatever your context may be, the redwood forests of Northern California or the Great Plains or anywhere that you are in the world, you have a very unique context. And within that ecological setting, you have unique plant communities, animal communities, and all of these are reflective of that time and place. To get out into your farm organism and go truly immerse yourself in it is an opportunity to, with humility, learn something from nature, to be open to it. And I think, again, if we think about the tens of thousands of years of human evolution and recognition of particular plants having healing properties, or some that maybe are toxic or even deadly, this is learning from nature as a teacher, right? And so I think the prep work for me is our lessons, our opportunities to humbly approach my relationship with nature and these elemental beings, and hopefully learn how to, one, become a better farmer, and two, a better person, more generous, more humble, and yeah, to me, I think there's real teachings in the prep work, in the act of doing.
Yeah, the initial indications were exactly that. There was over and done in 9 days, right? So that is not the beginning and the end of biodynamics and everything that we know about it. It's just the foundation stone, right? Peter Proctor moved it forward in his way with his barrel compost, and Maria Toon has moved us in a much more informed direction using the off-Earth influences from the sun or planets or constellations. Then there's the practitioners of biodynamics that have made those indications work for their individual system, and not one of them's going to be the same. And we certainly can't preach that to any other farmer, whether they're organic, biodynamic, or conventional, that, come to our side because we're doing it right. We're doing it within the best way that we understand, and with the tools that we have, and identifying areas to improve and further develop. And if somebody else comes and looks over the fence and wonders why our vines are somewhat, relatively healthy, then maybe they'll ask why, and we can tell them, well, you've got to put chamomile in an intestine, right?
We are happy to share this podcast with you from Troon Vineyard, a Demeter Biodynamic and Regenerative Organic certified winery in Oregon's Applegate Valley. We farm like the world depends on it and produce authentic, naturally crafted wines. We will be sharing these in-depth podcasts several times a month. To learn more, I encourage you to visit our website at troonvineyard.com and those of the Regenerative Organic Alliance at regenorganic.org and Demeter Biodynamics at demeter-usa.org. Thanks for sharing our voyage to regenerative agriculture with us.